Back in high school, I really loved the Punk Goes Pop compilations. And yes, for those unaware, they did make physical copies of these albums. Screamo covers of pop songs ultimately hit their peak between 2010 and 2014. Now, in order to understand the rise and fall of this trend, we gotta go back to the very beginning. As far back as the 1980s, it wasn't cool to like rock music and pop music at the same time. You could only like Metallica or Madonna, there was no in between. At the time, there were some bands that were covering pop songs. Exodus's cover of Lowrider by War is the one that comes to mind, as well as Kiss covering And Then He Kissed Me by the Crystals. One thing to take into consideration was the fact that these types of covers were done more so as a joke. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, and it definitely wasn't meant to pay tribute to the original artist. But this attitude started to shift about a decade later. Allow me to introduce you to Me First and the Gimme Gimmes. If you've never heard of these guys before, it was basically a supergroup cover band. This band was fronted by Fat Mike of NoFX, and it also contained members of Swingin' Utters and Lagwagon. And these guys would do punk covers of John Denver, Cher, Paula Abdul, the Dixie Chicks, the list goes on. Something similar was also happening in the world of nu metal as well. Those guys really loved 80s new wave. So for example, we had the band Orgy covering Blue Monday by New Order, this song actually being their biggest hit, arguably the song that put them on the map. We also had Limp Bizkit covering Faith, Disturbed covering Shout by Tears for Fears, and the big one, Alien Ant Farm covering Smooth Criminal by Michael Jackson. But these bands were actually covering pop music because they genuinely liked the artists and they wanted to pay tribute. Korn and Chino Moreno did not cover Wicked by Ice Cube as a joke. They did it because they grew up listening to Ice Cube as well as NWA, Snoop Dogg, and other West Coast hip-hop artists. And a few years prior to that, we had Anthrax teaming up with Public Enemy for their cover of Bring the Noise. This was a dream come true for Scott Ian because he always heard Chuck D's voice on his guitar tone. Now fast forward to the year 2000, and Fearless Records releases the first of what would become the Punk Goes series. And yes, the first installment was not Punk Goes Pop, it was actually Punk Goes Metal. This album had bands like AFI, Guttermouth, and the Aquabats covering music from Slayer, Guns N' Roses, Poison, etc. My favorite of which is actually Link 80's cover of Harvester of Sorrow by Metallica. I never thought that a ska cover of a Metallica song could be so good. Hearing that intro guitar riff played on the horn section literally makes it sound like you're riding into battle. And the first installment of Punk Goes Pop was released a year later in 2001. Now, contrary to popular belief, those first two records didn't really take off the way that you would have expected them to. Fearless Records would also try to release more compilations throughout that decade, such as Punk Goes 80s, Punk Goes 90s, and Punk Goes Acoustic, just to name a few. But all that immediately changed when Punk Goes Crunk was released in 2008. There were two standout tracks for me on this record. The first of which was All Time Low's cover of Umbrella by Rihanna, which in a way kinda kickstarted the music career of Crown the Empire and Post Malone. For some quick context, Post Malone used to be in a band called Drop Shot with Andy from Crown the Empire. They entered an 8th grade Battle of the Bands contest, and the song of choice was Umbrella by All Time Low. They ended up winning the contest, and the rest is history. And the other standout track for me was Still Fly by The Devil Wears Prada, originally by the Big Timers. Not only was this the song that personally introduced me to The Devil Wears Prada, but this was also the cover that kinda helped boost them up in popularity, if you will. And due to the success of Punk Goes Crunk, Fearless Records decided to release Punk Goes Pop Volume 2 a year later in 2009, and as a result, Volumes 3, 4, and 5 were released annually in 2010, 2011, and 2012 respectively. And around this time period, between 2010 and 2012, Screamo covers of pop songs were absolutely inescapable. Pretty much every underground metalcore band at the time wanted to be the next Devil Wears Prada, Askin' Alexandria, etc., so they figured, you know what, that Still Fly cover was pretty badass, why don't we try to do something like that? The channel that I was constantly visiting at the time was Eddie is the Man 2. This person was always uploading Screamo covers of pop songs. And this channel right now is hitting me like a wave of nostalgia because this is actually where I discovered Crown the Empire for the first time. So as big as these metalcore covers were, how did they ultimately meet their demise? In my honest opinion, I think it really just came down to oversaturation of the market. In a way, it's kind of like what happened to Guitar Hero. There was way too much of a good thing, and then eventually people just sort of lost interest. And if I'm being completely honest here, the last time that I heard about a band getting a huge boost in popularity from a pop cover was back in 2014 when Blank Space by Taylor Swift was covered by I Prevail. That was almost 10 years ago, guys. Now, is there still a market for this stuff? Sure. I mean, Our Last Light, for example, 3 million views on their cover of Old Town Road, and that was only 4 years ago. And even if you look at the covers that they've posted recently, they still get a pretty decent amount of views, but nothing compared to what they were getting in the very beginning. And I think in most cases when people are talking about their favorite Punk Goes Pop album, it's usually 2, 3, or 4. Ain't nobody talking about Punk Goes Pop Volume 7. I don't even think a lot of people realize that this was released in 2017. It didn't really get a lot of hype compared to the other volumes. And as much as I would secretly love for Punk Goes Pop Volume 8 to be a thing, I really don't see it happening. Mainly due to the fact that some of the songs in the previous compilations didn't really age well, such as the Word Alive's cover of Mercy, which actually uses the N-word a couple of times. Same thing with the Notorious Thugs cover by Scary Kids Scaring Kids. And I don't know what happened to this particular cover, but Upon a Burning Body teamed up with Ice-T to do a cover of Turned Down for What for Volume 6. They had a music video and everything, and I think it was actually sponsored by Spencer's, but for some reason I can't find the original upload anywhere, and it's not on the album anymore. When they re-released it for the deluxe edition or whatever, they completely took it out. So I don't know what's going on with this thing. So at the end of the day, Screamo covers of pop songs became popular because a lot of these metalcore bands thought that this was going to be their ticket to stardom. But they also didn't take into consideration that you have to have good original music too. Bands like Devil Wears Prada, Askin' Alexandria, A Day to Remember, they had really good songs already. The cover song literally just helped boost them up into popularity. As badass as DWP's cover of Still Fly is, I don't think that this was the song that really put them on the map. And unfortunately, most of these bands met the same fate as Alien Ant Farm or even Orgy. They had a really good cover song that definitely boosted them into popularity, but unfortunately their original tracks just weren't as good as the cover. So that's ultimately why they ended up flopping at the end of the day. And I'm not talking trash about Alien Ant Farm by any means, I personally love that band. But what do you guys think? Do you think Punk Goes Pop can really make a comeback? And what were some of your favorite Screamo covers of pop songs? Let me know in the comments below.